There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a house right before a colossal betrayal is dragged out into the daylight. I just did not realize the quiet in my own home had been masking a profound deception for years. I am 68 years old, and I spent 40 of those years building an absolute fortress of financial security. I worked in commercial real estate, grinding out 60-hour weeks, missing holidays, and sacrificing my youth to ensure my golden years were completely devoid of panic. I wanted to reach a point where I would never have to lose a moment of sleep over a broken water heater, a fluctuating stock market, or an unexpected medical bill. When I married my second wife, Helen, 15 years ago, I sincerely believed I was sharing that hard-earned peace with a partner who respected the journey. I thought we were building a quiet, comfortable final chapter together. Instead, I unknowingly opened the vault to her wildly entitled son, Marcus. Marcus is 35 years old, though you would swear he was a teenager trapped in an extended phase of rebellion. Armed with a taste for luxury goods he never actually earned, he calls himself an entrepreneur. In reality, he is a professional parasite. Over the last decade, I have funded 3 of his absolutely guaranteed business ventures. First, it was a bespoke dog walking application that catastrophically crashed before it secured a single paying user. Then, he passionately pitched a line of imported artisanal energy drinks that ended up sitting stacked in my garage until the cans literally expired and began leaking. Finally, he started a vague high-end consulting firm where he was the only employee, consulting absolutely no one but expecting a CEO's salary. I paid for every single failure. I covered the startup costs, the massive debts, and the legal fees when things inevitably fell apart. I did it to keep the peace. Helen would look at me with those wide, pleading eyes, insisting he just needed one more chance to find his footing in a tough economy. Like an absolute fool, I would sigh, pull out my checkbook, and write the check. I told myself it was simply the price of admission for a quiet marriage and a happy wife. I reasoned that I had more than enough money to absorb the blows. I should have known that appeasing a leech only makes it infinitely thirstier. I always assumed Helen was just a blindly supportive mother, but lately, her defensive maneuvers regarding his finances felt far too orchestrated, almost like she had a deeply vested interest in keeping my wallet open and my critical questions completely shut down. The illusion finally shattered on a Tuesday morning. It was crisp, sunny, and perfectly ordinary. I woke up at 6 o'clock, brewed my dark roast coffee, and walked into my oak-paneled study to review my portfolio before the financial markets opened. I have a strict, unchanging routine. My wallet always sits on the right corner of my mahogany desk, exactly parallel to my vintage brass reading lamp. It is a thick, worn leather piece I bought during a trip to Florence 20 years ago. When I reached for it to pull out my primary premium credit card to pay a quarterly property tax bill online, my fingers met the smooth, familiar leather, but the designated front slot was completely empty. I paused. I checked my pockets. I checked the floor beneath a heavy wooden desk. I walked out and meticulously checked the kitchen counter where I had placed my keys the night before. Nothing. A cold, heavy knot immediately formed in the pit of my stomach. It was not panic because of a misplaced piece of plastic. It was a sudden, sickening intuition. Marcus had been over the night before for one of Helen's extravagant, mandatory family dinners. She had roasted a prime rib, his absolute favorite meal. She had poured him my expensive reserve wine, the bottles I specifically saved for anniversaries and major celebrations. I remembered sitting at the head of the table, watching them laugh together, a closed loop of affection that I was only allowed to silently fund, never truly join. He had spent the entire evening dominating the conversation, bragging loudly about some new ambiguous high-level networking group he had supposedly joined downtown. Halfway through the meal, he had abruptly excused himself to use the restroom located straight down the hall from my study. He had been gone for at least 20 minutes. At the time, I brushed it off, assuming he was taking a phone call. Now, the memory felt like a blaring siren in my head. When Marcus returned to the dining room from his extended trip down the hall, He was practically vibrating with a strange, manic energy. He had poured himself another massive glass of my best wine and confidently offered a toast to his incredibly bright future. Helen had beamed at him across the table, her eyes shining with absolute, unquestioning pride. Looking back with sudden, crystal-clear hindsight, I realized his flushed face was not from the alcohol. It was the pure, intoxicating adrenaline of a successful theft. I walked back into my study, sat down heavily at my computer, and felt my heart hammering a slow, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. I opened my banking application. My hands were perfectly steady, but my chest felt incredibly tight, as if someone had wrapped a steel band around my lungs. I navigated directly to the pending transactions page for that specific missing card. The premium credit card he took was a solid black metal edition I earned through decades of immaculate financial history. It does not have a preset spending limit. It is explicitly designed for buying high-value artwork at auctions, securing commercial property deposits, or booking international first-class flights in an emergency. It is certainly not meant for funding a grown man's desperate, pathetic grab at status. I had left it conveniently in the wallet simply because I had used it earlier that afternoon to secure a hefty deposit for a luxury European river cruise Helen had been begging me to take for 3 years. The irony was physically nauseating. I was literally paying for her dream vacation while her son was treating my private study like his personal, unsupervised piggy bank. The screen loaded. Right at the very top of the ledger, glowing with an arrogant, undeniable finality, was a pending charge. $45,000. I blinked rapidly, genuinely thinking the bright screen was playing cruel tricks on my tired, aging eyes. I leaned in closer until my nose was almost touching the monitor. The vendor was clearly listed as a high-end boutique jeweler located in the wealthiest district downtown. It was a place renowned for importing highly exclusive Swiss timepieces, a store that essentially required a financial background check and a private appointment just to walk through the heavy glass front doors. $45,000. I stared at the glowing numbers until they completely blurred together into a meaningless digital smudge. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. It was not merely the staggering amount of money, though $45,000 is a devastating, life-altering blow by any normal standard. It was the absolute, unadulterated audacity of the act. He had boldly walked into my private sanctuary, opened my personal wallet, physically stolen my card, and spent the equivalent of a luxury sports car on a completely unnecessary piece of jewelry. He actually thought I would not notice the massive charge. Or worse, he calculated that I would notice, but that I would just quietly absorb the catastrophic cost like I had absorbed every other financial hit he had delivered over the past 10 years. He assumed my desperate desire for domestic peace would completely override my personal dignity. He thought I was just a tired old man who would rather lose a fortune than start an argument. My first instinct was to reach for the telephone sitting on my desk and immediately dial the authorities. It would have been incredibly easy. One short phone call to the bank's fraud department, one call to the local police precinct, and Marcus would be sitting in the back of a squad car in handcuffs before lunchtime. But my hand hovered over the heavy black receiver, and then, very slowly, I pulled it away. Calling the police right now would cause a massive, explosive, uncontrollable fight. Helen would instantly play the victim, crying hysterically on the living room floor, viciously screaming and begging me not to ruin her precious son's life over a simple, fixable misunderstanding. She would relentlessly manipulate the narrative until I was somehow painted as the cruel, heartless villain for lacking basic paternal compassion. No, a swift arrest was entirely too good for him. It was far too fast. It would not teach him the agonizing, life-shattering lesson he so desperately needed. Furthermore, a single, brazen theft, as massive as it was, felt like merely the tip of a much larger, much darker iceberg. If he was arrogant enough to steal a physical card right out of my study while I sat just rooms away eating his mother's prime rib, what else had he been doing behind my back? What other accounts had been compromised? What else had Helen been allowing? or perhaps even actively encouraging. While I was distracted by my work, I needed total, uncompromising visibility into my entire financial life before I launched any sort of counterattack. The betrayal cut so deeply it felt structural, as if the very foundation of my home had just severely cracked beneath my feet. I had provided everything for this family. I had paid off the mortgage. I had funded the generous family trust. I had given Marcus countless expensive chances to prove himself as a capable man. Instead, he made the active choice to be a common thief. He viewed my generosity as extreme weakness and my endless patience as sheer stupidity. He sincerely thought he was playing a brilliant, flawless game against an old, clueless Mark. He failed to realize that men who build empires from absolutely nothing do not become successful by being soft, vulnerable targets. We become successful by knowing exactly when to stay perfectly quiet and exactly how to strike back so hard the opponent never recovers. The era of the quiet, generous, accommodating stepfather was officially over. I closed the banking application, folded my hands neatly on my desk, and took a long, deep breath, feeling a new, terrifying calm wash over me. The hardest part about walking into a room knowing you have been robbed by your own family is forcing your expression to remain completely neutral while your blood is practically boiling in your veins. Confronting a thief is one thing, but confronting a thief who believes he is entirely entitled to your life savings requires a very specific, ironclad kind of discipline. I left the quiet sanctuary of my study and walked slowly down the hardwood hallway toward the kitchen. It was barely 10 o'clock in the morning, but Marcus was already back inside my house. He had a persistent, irritating habit of letting himself in through the garage whenever he pleased, a boundary I had repeatedly asked Helen to enforce, but one she always conveniently forgot or brushed aside as me being overly rigid. He was sitting casually at my massive granite kitchen island, sipping a freshly made espresso from my machine, laughing loudly at a video playing on his smartphone, and there it was. Resting heavily on his left wrist was $45,000 of stolen platinum and sapphire crystal. It was a massive, incredibly ostentatious dive watch, the specific kind engineered for deep-sea exploration but exclusively worn by men who have never ventured deeper than the shallow end of a country club swimming pool. The morning sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows caught the polished metal, making it practically blinding. It looked completely absurd and entirely out of place next to his casual designer sweatpants and pristine, unworn athletic shoes. He looked exactly like a little boy playing dress-up with a wealthy man's wardrobe. I walked over, grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water from the refrigerator, and stood directly across the island from him. I did not yell. I did not throw the glass against the wall. I simply looked down at the massive timepiece, then slowly raised my gaze to meet his eyes, and calmly asked him exactly when he planned to return my black premium credit card to my desk. I fully expected a momentary flash of panic. I expected a poorly constructed, desperate lie about finding it on the floor and taking it for safekeeping. I thought he might at least try to deny the gravity of what he had done. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his espresso, set the tiny cup down, and smiled. It was a smug, deeply infuriating smirk that instantly made my jaw clench. He casually told me the card was safely sitting in the center console of his luxury sedan, and he would be sure to grab it for me before he headed out for the day. Then, with an audacity that genuinely took my breath away, he actually held his wrist up, tilting his arm so the watch caught the light again. He looked me dead in the eye and asked me if I liked his new acquisition. I asked him if he had completely lost his mind. I demanded to know how he could justify walking into my private office and stealing a piece of plastic to fund a shopping spree. He waved his hand dismissively, telling me to lower my voice and look at the bigger picture. He explained, using a patronizing tone one might use to placate a highly confused, elderly patient, that he had a massive networking lunch scheduled with international investors later that week. In his warped, entirely delusional reality, wearing a $45,000 watch was absolutely essential to closing a massive, life-changing deal. He claimed these high-level businessmen only respected highly visible wealth, and that he needed to project an image of extreme, undeniable success just to get his foot in the door. Then came the phrase that nearly made my vision go entirely black. He casually leaned back on the bar stool and referred to the theft as a simple, early inheritance advance. He actually used those exact words. He argued that since the money in my accounts would eventually belong to him anyway, he was simply streamlining the administrative process to build his entrepreneurial empire a few years ahead of schedule. The sheer callousness of his logic was physically staggering. He specifically mentioned the family trust fund. He proved in that single moment that he had been snooping through far more than just my leather wallet. He knew the exact legal terminology of the documents locked in my filing cabinet. He knew he was a listed primary beneficiary. He spoke about my eventual passing with such casual, chilling indifference, treating my death as nothing more than a highly anticipated, impending payday. He was looking at a living, breathing man who had housed him and fed him, and seeing absolutely nothing but a delayed bank transfer. Before I could fully articulate the absolute absurdity and disrespect of his statement, the heavy wooden door leading to the garage swung open. Helen walked in, returning from her morning tennis clinic, her face flushed and a bright white towel draped over her shoulders. She took one single look at my rigid posture and the tight, confrontational atmosphere hanging over the kitchen island, and instantly dropped her expensive gym bag onto the floor. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not ask for my side of the story. She immediately rushed across the room to stand right beside her adult son, instantly forming a physical and emotional united front against me in my very own kitchen. I clearly and calmly laid out the absolute facts. I told my wife that Marcus had stolen my premium credit card from my private study and fraudulently charged $45,000 for a piece of jewelry. I fully expected her to gasp in horror, to turn her anger on him, to demand he drive back to the jeweler and return the stolen merchandise immediately. Instead, she let out a long, highly exasperated sigh, rolled her eyes toward the ceiling, and firmly crossed her arms over her chest. Helen looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and absolute disdain. She loudly asked why I was insisting on making such a massive, dramatic scene over a completely trivial business expense. A trivial business expense. She immediately echoed his exact, delusional talking points, insisting that I simply did not understand the modern fast-paced business world and how crucial a powerful image was for a young, hungry entrepreneur trying to make a name for himself. She then launched into a vicious, deeply personal, well-rehearsed attack on my entire character. She called me impossibly stingy and hopelessly controlling. She rapidly listed off the commercial properties I owned, the stock dividends I received quarterly, and the healthy, compounding balances of my checking accounts, weaponizing my 40 years of grueling, back-breaking labor against me as if my earned wealth magically negated the blatant crime of theft. She stated out loud that $45,000 was barely a drop in the vast ocean of my total assets, implying I was petty for even noticing it was gone. She accused me of actively trying to financially control Marcus, of secretly wanting his ventures to fail so I could keep him permanently trapped underneath my thumb, reliant on my charity. She told me I should be absolutely ashamed of myself for not willingly and joyfully supporting his brilliant career trajectory. Standing there, listening to the woman I had promised to protect and provide for viciously tear me down to protect a common thief, I felt a massive, fundamental shift permanently lock into place within my chest. The hot, burning anger evaporated, entirely replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. This was the exact moment the heavy blinders finally fell completely away from my eyes. I looked at my wife, genuinely looking at the reality of her for the first time in 15 years. I saw the cold calculation hiding just behind her feigned, dramatic outrage. I saw the endless, bottomless greed masking itself as protective maternal concern. I realized that every single time she had cried and begged me to fund his miserable, doomed failures, it was never out of a genuine hope for his independent success. It was a unified, coordinated effort to siphon my hard-earned resources directly into his ungrateful pockets. They were a unified team, and I was merely the heavily guarded bank they were aggressively robbing in broad daylight. I had not built a loving partnership. I had unwittingly served as an immensely profitable host organism for a pair of absolute parasites. She thought her raised voice, her dramatic accusations, and her emotional manipulation would force me into a quiet, apologetic submission, just like they had 100 times before, completely unaware that this time, I was actively writing an entirely different script in my head. I knew that arguing with two deeply entitled, delusional people was a complete waste of precious energy. I needed them comfortable. I needed them incredibly arrogant. I needed them to believe they held all the power. So, I did the hardest, most humiliating thing I have ever done in my entire life. I physically lowered my shoulders, dropped my gaze to the floor, and massaged my temples as if I was simply too exhausted to continue the fight. I let out a long, defeated sigh and muttered something about simply wanting a heads up next time, completely playing the exact role of the beaten, passive, endlessly compliant provider they expected me to be. Helen's tight, angry face instantly softened into a victorious, highly condescending smile. She walked over, kissed me lightly on the cheek, and warmly praised me for finally being a reasonable, supportive father. The sheer hypocrisy of her affection was physically revolting, but I swallowed the bile down and nodded quietly. I watched Marcus finish the last drop of his espresso, grab his expensive car keys off the counter, and confidently walk out of my house. Marcus smugly adjusted the heavy platinum band on his wrist as he walked through the door, totally oblivious to the absolute financial hellfire that specific piece of jewelry was about to rain down upon his entirely fabricated life. I let them think they had won the absolute final victory of the war, when in reality, they had just hand-delivered me the exact, undeniable ammunition I needed to completely and legally dismantle their entire world. The most dangerous kind of enemy is the one who has convinced you they have completely surrendered. I retreated to my study under the guise of an exhausted, defeated old man. But the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, my mourning period ended and my investigation began. Helen had strutted out of the house shortly after Marcus left, happily announcing she was going to meet her girlfriends for a late brunch to celebrate the beautiful afternoon. She actually had the nerve to ask me if I needed anything from the specialty bakery downtown before she kissed my cheek, completely high on the false power of having just crushed my resistance. I told her to take her time and enjoy her day, keeping my voice soft and perfectly compliant. I stood by the window and listened to the engine of her luxury sports utility vehicle fade down the long driveway. The house fell dead silent again, but this time, the quiet was entirely mine to weaponize. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, the exact spot where the brazen theft had occurred just hours earlier, and opened my laptop. I did not just open the primary banking application this time. I opened every single financial portal connected to my name. I pulled up my massive investment portfolios, my quarterly tax returns spanning the last half-decade, the joint checking and savings accounts I shared with Helen, and the highly secured digital vault containing the master documents for the family trust I had painstakingly established exactly 10 years ago. I had always handled the heavy lifting when it came to our vast finances, but I had trusted Helen with the day-to-day household management. I provided a very generous monthly allowance, an amount that exceeded most people's entire monthly salaries, into our joint checking account to cover groceries, utilities, and general maintenance, never once demanding to see a paper receipt. I believed that auditing a spouse over a simple grocery bill was entirely beneath me. I believed I was providing her with the profound dignity and autonomy a true life partner deserved. Now, looking at the glowing screen, I realized my blind, arrogant trust was simply a wide-open back door she had been casually walking through for years. The massive family trust document held a specific, heavily buried clause I had insisted upon a decade ago during its initial drafting. A tiny, deeply complex legal failsafe that Marcus and Helen had completely overlooked in their blinding arrogance. That single paragraph of archaic legalese was going to be the absolute cornerstone of my total retaliation. But before I could trigger it and bring their comfortable world crashing down, I needed to understand exactly how much damage had already been done. I started pulling the digital statements for the joint household account, working backward month by single month. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal, almost overwhelmingly boring. There were standard charges from the local premium supermarket, the high-end dry cleaners, and the professional landscaping company that maintained our massive front lawn. But as I started cross-referencing the specific dates and the exact dollar amounts against my personal calendar, a sickening, undeniable pattern began to emerge from the endless digital spreadsheet. There was a charge for $2,500 labeled as a routine plumbing repair for our guest bathroom. I distinctly remembered the toilet leaking that particular week, but I also remembered our regular, highly reliable handyman fixing the simple issue for $200 in cash. I dug much deeper into the bank's digital routing information. Pulling up the electronic transfer receipts, that $2,500 had not gone to any plumbing service. It had been transferred through a popular third-party payment application directly to an account registered entirely under Marcus's mobile phone number. I kept scrolling, my chest incredibly tight, my breathing shallow and highly deliberate. 6 months prior to that plumbing incident, there was a massive withdrawal for $4,000, explicitly labeled in the ledger as emergency veterinary surgery for Helen's purebred spaniel. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. The dog had never even been sick. He had never missed a single meal or a daily walk. That money had also vanished into the digital ether, funneled straight to her precious son to fund whatever miserable, doomed business failure he was focused on that month. The deeper I dug into the past 3 years of our shared financial history, the more the absolute horror of her calculated deceit revealed itself. It was an absolute masterclass in parasitic siphoning. She had been bleeding me dry with 1,000 tiny, perfectly disguised cuts, a $500 grocery run that only yielded 2 small bags of actual food, a $1,000 charge for a weekend wellness spa retreat that she miraculously took on the exact same weekend Marcus was supposedly traveling for an important, self-funded business conference. She was entirely subsidizing his lavish, completely fake entrepreneurial lifestyle, using the very money I was giving her to manage our shared, supposedly happy home. By the time I reached the bottom of a comprehensive 3-year audit, my eyes burning from staring at the bright screen, I had tallied up over $85,000 in completely fraudulent, carefully disguised transfers, combined with the $45,000 he had brazenly stolen that very morning for the platinum watch. I was looking at a staggering 6-figure theft coordinated entirely by the woman currently sleeping in my bed. Seeing the sheer, unadulterated volume of her deceit meticulously laid out in perfect rows and columns made me realize that simply stopping the bleeding was not going to be nearly enough. I had to completely and permanently drain the well she thought she perpetually controlled. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and stared up at the crown molding on the ceiling of my quiet study. The emotional weight of the discovery was crushing, yet strangely, powerfully liberating. For 15 years, I had questioned if I was perhaps being too harsh, if my expectations of a grown man were simply too rigid, or if I was failing to be the warm, unconditionally supportive partner Helen desperately needed. I had carried the heavy, exhausting guilt of those endless questions for over a decade. In a matter of 4 intense hours, that guilt completely evaporated, instantly replaced by the cold, hard steel of absolute resolve. I was not a beloved husband. I was not a respected father figure. I was an automated teller machine with a pulse. Every warm smile she gave me across the dinner table, every soft kiss on the cheek before bed, every single time she told me how much she appreciated my hard work, it was all a meticulously calculated, incredibly cold transaction. She was essentially a highly paid, utterly ruthless employee masquerading as a loving wife, strictly managing my emotions to ensure the steady, uninterrupted flow of capital never ceased. The grief of losing a marriage is profound, But the profound indignity of realizing the marriage was never actually real to begin with is a completely different kind of agony. It burns away any lingering trace of hesitation or mercy. I had spent 40 years building my commercial real estate empire through sheer force of will, negotiating with ruthless developers, and navigating brutal, unforgiving economic downturns. I had survived and thrived entirely by being smarter, more thoroughly prepared, and utterly unsentimental when a massive business deal went sour. This marriage, I now fully understood with total clarity, was simply the absolute worst business deal I had ever made in my entire life. I carefully closed the spreadsheets and meticulously cleared my digital browsing history, ensuring no trace of my audit remained. I locked the heavy screen of my computer and placed my hands flat on the smooth, cool mahogany surface of my desk. My breathing was completely steady now. The tremor of fresh, hot anger that had shaken my hands earlier that morning was completely gone. In its place was a terrifying, crystal clear, almost peaceful focus. There was absolutely no going back from this specific moment in time. I could never look at Helen again without seeing a master manipulator and a common thief. I could never look at Marcus without seeing a smug, entitled parasite feeding off my life's work. If I confronted them now with the printed spreadsheets, Helen would simply pivot. She would instantly cry. She would invent elaborate, highly emotional excuses about Marcus being in terrible, life-threatening danger or deep trouble with dangerous loan sharks. And she would try to manipulate my inherent sense of obligation one last time. I flatly refused to give her the opportunity to speak another lie. Instead, I reached for my smartphone and opened my highly encrypted contact list. I intentionally bypassed the numbers for the local police department and the bank's fraud division. I scrolled slowly past the personal family contacts and the local country club directory. I stopped on a specific contact listed simply under the name of an old, incredibly expensive, heavily connected friend. It was officially time to wake up my legal architect and begin tearing this rotten, deceitful house down to its very foundation, brick by expensive brick. There is a distinct, dangerous thrill in realizing the very laws designed to protect your family can be seamlessly weaponized to completely destroy a parasite. The moment I dialed the private number of my estate attorney, the game shifted entirely from quiet domestic survival to absolute, calculated eradication. Arthur is a man who understands the cold mechanics of wealth better than anyone I have ever met. We have worked together intimately for over 20 years. He helped me meticulously structure my most complex commercial real estate acquisitions. And, disastrously, he helped me draft the massive family trust that was currently bleeding me dry. I did not call his busy downtown office line. I bypassed the secretaries and dialed his direct mobile phone, a number strictly reserved for massive corporate mergers or extreme personal emergencies. When he answered, I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of the blinding anger I had felt in the kitchen earlier that morning. I told him I needed 2 hours of his undivided attention that very afternoon, and that we needed to fundamentally restructure my entire legacy from the ground up. He did not ask a single clarifying question. He knows the tone of my voice when a major negotiation is happening. He simply told me to come through his private rear entrance at 2 o'clock sharp. Getting out of my house was entirely effortless, which only reinforced the sickening reality of my marriage. Helen returned from her lavish afternoon brunch glowing with artificial happiness, carrying a box of highly expensive imported pastries she had happily purchased with my money. I smiled warmly, accepted a flaky almond croissant, and casually mentioned I needed to drive across town to personally inspect a minor, persistent roof leak at one of my older commercial warehouse properties. She kissed my cheek and gently told me not to work too hard, already turning her attention back to her glowing smartphone to text her son. She had absolutely no idea she was cheerfully waving goodbye to her entire financial future. Arthur's office is a heavily soundproofed fortress of dark leather, polished oak, and absolute legal discretion. When I sat down in the heavy chair directly across from his massive desk, I did not waste a single second on pleasantries or polite conversation. I unclasped my leather briefcase and handed him the printed, highly detailed financial audit I had spent the entire morning compiling in my study. I sat in complete silence and watched his sharp, deeply experienced eyes scan the long columns of fraudulent transfers, the fake plumbing invoices, the phantom veterinary bills, and finally, the colossal $45,000 jewelry charge from that very morning. Arthur let out a low, slow whistle, slowly removing his wire-rimmed reading glasses and placing them on the blotter. He looked at me with a grim expression and plainly stated that I had a massive, highly coordinated theft occurring under my own roof. I nodded slowly. I told him I was entirely aware of the criminal activity, but I was not sitting in his office to press immediate, messy criminal charges just yet. I was there to sever the financial umbilical cord so cleanly, legally, and completely that they would never even see the blade coming. We walked over to his heavy fireproof filing cabinet and pulled the thick, legally bound master file for the revocable living trust I had established exactly 10 years ago. Back then, I was a foolish, blindly optimistic man who sincerely wanted to ensure Helen and her son were perpetually comfortable and safe. The trust was specifically designed to be an impenetrable legal shield against heavy estate taxes and long, drawn-out probate courts. It named Marcus as a primary, protected beneficiary upon my eventual passing, legally entitling him to millions of dollars in liquid assets and prime commercial real estate. Even worse, it contained a deeply generous active provision that currently paid him a living stipend of $5,000 on the first day of every single month, essentially subsidizing his utterly useless, fabricated entrepreneurial existence. I looked Arthur dead in the eye, pointing a firm finger at the thick stack of paper, and gave him my first absolute directive. I told him to burn Marcus out of the document completely. I instructed my attorney to completely dissolve his portion of the family trust, immediately and permanently revoking his protected status as a beneficiary. I wanted every single mention of his name meticulously scrubbed from the legal framework of my entire life. Furthermore, I ordered the immediate, unappealable termination of that $5,000 monthly stipend. Arthur's fingers practically flew across his heavy mechanical keyboard, rapidly drafting the severe, ironclad legal amendments that would officially turn my arrogant stepson from a multimillionaire heir into a broke, heavily indebted stranger. Instead of enriching a deeply entitled parasite, I directed Arthur to redirect the absolute bulk of my estate, including the eventual highly profitable sale of my commercial properties, directly to a highly rated, fiercely audited national charity dedicated to building accessible, mortgage-free housing for permanently disabled military veterans. If my 4 decades of grueling, exhausting labor were going to benefit anyone after I was gone, it was going to be men and women who actually understood the true, profound concepts of sacrifice, duty, and honor. Not a 35-year-old child wearing a stolen platinum watch. Watching Arthur print those fresh, legally binding, heavily watermarked documents was the most profoundly satisfying moment I had experienced in 15 long years. But fixing the trust was only the structural foundation of the retaliation. Next came the active weaponization of the immediate theft. We moved on to the stolen black premium credit card. Arthur immediately drafted the formal, legally binding paperwork required to report the $45,000 charge as a massive, undeniably fraudulent transaction. He prepared the heavy sworn affidavits and the official banking dispute forms, perfectly laying out the exact timeline of the theft from my private study. He placed his heavy gold fountain pen on the desk, fully expecting me to sign the forms right then and there so he could immediately fax them to the bank's aggressive fraud department. I picked up the heavy gold pen, felt its cool weight in my hand, and then very slowly placed it back down on the polished oak wood. I looked at my brilliant lawyer and calmly told him to hold the drafted documents in a secure iron safe. He looked at me with genuine, profound confusion, leaning forward to warn me that delaying a massive fraud report by even a few days could severely complicate the bank's internal investigation and potentially leave me liable for the stolen funds. But I had a very specific, deeply satisfying, entirely ruthless schedule playing out in my mind. I did not want the aggressive boutique jeweler or the furious bank calling Marcus today. While he was still riding the euphoric high of his arrogant, supposedly successful robbery, I needed the timing to be absolutely flawless, striking the precise moment his manufactured, arrogant world was most reliant on my stolen credit line. I knew exactly when he was planning to loudly showcase that massive dive watch to his supposed international business investors, and I wanted the trap to violently snap shut on his wrist at the absolute worst possible second. Arthur stared at me for a long moment, and then a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across his face, finally understanding the true, terrifying depth of the cold, calculated strategy I was executing. He silently picked up the drafted fraud paperwork, slid it into a thick red folder, and locked it securely inside his heavy wall safe, entirely ready to be unleashed the very second I gave the final, devastating telephone command. I signed the newly amended, ironclad trust documents, pressing down so hard with the black ink that the heavy metal pen nearly tore through the thick, expensive parchment paper. In a matter of 2 quiet, highly efficient hours, I had completely and legally reclaimed my entire legacy. Marcus was officially and legally cut off from the monthly cash flow he blindly relied upon to survive, and his massive, golden parachute of an inheritance had completely evaporated into thin air. Helen's incredibly comfortable future, deeply intertwined with her son's inevitable, rapidly approaching financial ruin, was also quietly ticking down toward an explosive, unavoidable devastation she could not possibly anticipate or prevent. I sincerely thanked Arthur, shook his hand warmly, and walked out of his heavily air-conditioned office building into the bright, warm, late-afternoon sun. Stepping onto the concrete sidewalk, I genuinely felt 30 years younger. The crushing, heavy, suffocating burden of being a manipulated, unappreciated provider was completely gone, instantly replaced by the thrilling, silent power of a man holding a perfectly primed detonator. Now, all I had to do was drive back to my quiet, comfortable suburban house, eat my deceitful wife's carefully prepared evening dinners, and play the role of the oblivious, defeated, endlessly generous old fool for just a few more agonizing days. There is a profound, almost intoxicating danger in letting your enemies believe they have completely broken your spirit. It is a psychological tightrope walk over a deeply active volcano, requiring you to smile warmly, pour the expensive wine, and nod in quiet submission while perfectly anticipating the exact devastating moment they will burn. Driving back to my sprawling suburban house from Arthur's heavily air-conditioned downtown office, the steering wheel felt entirely different in my hands. Earlier that morning, I had been a victim, a blindly trusting fool actively being robbed by the very people he swore to protect. Now, with the freshly signed legal documents securely locked inside a fireproof steel safe, I was an absolute architect of ruin. My massive legacy was no longer a vulnerable, open buffet. It was a heavily armed fortress once again. Yet, the true test of my resolve was not signing the harsh legal paperwork. It was walking back through my own front door and playing the thoroughly defeated, more obedient old man for an audience of 2 highly observant, endlessly greedy parasites. I pulled my vehicle into the massive 3-car garage and took one final, incredibly deep breath, forcing my shoulders to slump forward and intentionally replacing the sharp, cold focus in my eyes with a dull, exhausted resignation. I walked into the kitchen, dropping my keys heavily onto the granite counter. Helen was standing by the stove, cheerfully stirring a rich, heavily aromatic sauce for our evening meal. She immediately turned, wiped her hands on a pristine linen towel, and asked me how the messy roof inspection at the commercial warehouse went. I let out a long, highly believable sigh, rubbing the back of my neck as if carrying the weight of the entire world. I muttered something about corrupt contractors and incredibly expensive, unexpected repair bills, leaning heavily against the counter. Helen's eyes instantly softened into a mask of pure, manufactured maternal sympathy. She walked over, wrapped her arms around my waist, and gently kissed my cheek. softly assuring me that my incredibly hard work was what kept our beautiful family so safe and secure. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of her embrace nearly made me physically recoil, but I forced myself to lean into her touch, weakly thanking her for her endless support. I was performing the role of a lifetime, entirely fueled by a cold, deeply buried rage. The absolute pinnacle of this agonizing performance arrived just 3 days later, during our traditional Sunday evening family dinner. Helen had aggressively expanded the guest list, inviting her younger sister, Martha, and Martha's incredibly loud, deeply obnoxious husband, Greg. It was a perfectly staged, highly calculated audience specifically designed to let Marcus parade his entirely fabricated success. Marcus arrived precisely 20 minutes late, a deliberate, highly arrogant power move designed to make everyone wait for his grand entrance. He strolled into the formal dining room wearing a sharply tailored designer suit without a tie, perfectly cultivating the image of a young, effortlessly wealthy tech mogul. And there, resting heavily on his left wrist, boldly catching the warm light of the crystal chandelier, was the $45,000 platinum dive watch he had blatantly stolen from my private desk. He had intentionally rolled his left shirt cuff up just a fraction of an inch higher than the right, ensuring the massive, stolen timepiece was absolutely impossible to ignore. Throughout the elaborate 4-course meal, Marcus completely dominated the conversation. He loudly regaled Martha and Greg with deeply complex, entirely fictional stories about a massive international merger he was supposedly brokering with heavy investors in Tokyo and London. He used complicated financial buzzwords entirely out of context, aggressively waving his hands to emphasize his completely hollow points. Every time that heavy platinum band flashed across my field of vision, I simply took a slow, calm sip of my expensive red wine, feeling a deep, secret thrill knowing exactly the catastrophic price that stolen metal was about to extract from his pathetic life. The true height of his breathtaking arrogance occurred right as Helen was proudly serving the heavy chocolate dessert. Greg, thoroughly fooled by the elaborate charade, loudly asked Marcus what his next massive power move was going to be. Marcus casually leaned back in his heavy oak chair, took a slow sip of his espresso, and casually announced he was heading to the imported luxury car dealership on Tuesday afternoon. He confidently declared he was entirely exhausted by his current, perfectly reliable luxury sedan and was upgrading to a heavily customized, high-performance German sports car. He casually dropped the estimated price tag of $140,000 right onto the dining room table, causing Martha to dramatically gasp and Helen to beam with absolute, unshakable pride. Greg nervously chuckled and asked how a young man manages that kind of massive monthly financing. Even with a successful business, Marcus offered a smug, deeply punchable smile. He proudly claimed his new consulting contracts would easily cover the baseline payments, but he specifically leaned forward, looked directly at me, and boldly stated that his incredibly stable, ironclad monthly trust dividends gave him the absolute perfect financial safety net for such an aggressive, high-level acquisition. He was sitting at my table, eating the expensive food I purchased, wearing a massive watch he bought with my stolen credit card, and openly bragging about using the $5,000 monthly trust stipend I provided to finance a completely unnecessary luxury sports car. Before Helen could nervously intervene, entirely expecting me to launch into a massive, bitter lecture about financial responsibility and the dangers of extreme debt, I did the absolute last thing any of them anticipated. I gently placed my heavy silver dessert spoon down on the table, wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, and offered Marcus a warm, highly encouraging smile. I clearly and calmly told him it sounded like an incredibly aggressive, highly forward-thinking maneuver. I stated that if his business was truly booming the way he claimed, he absolutely deserved to enjoy the heavy fruits of his massive success. I even suggested he opt for the upgraded leather interior, completely validating his disastrous, utterly delusional financial fantasy. The entire dining room fell completely silent. Helen stared at me, her mouth slightly open in genuine shock, entirely unable to process my sudden, total capitulation. Marcus looked briefly confused, searching my eyes for any trace of sarcasm or hidden anger, but I gave him absolutely nothing but a bland, supportive facade. Slowly, a massive, victorious grin spread across his face. He proudly raised his water glass in my direction, loudly thanking me for finally understanding the fast-paced modern economy. Helen practically vibrated with joy, immediately launching into a long, highly emotional speech about how beautiful it was to see the two most important men in her life finally bonding and respecting one another. I smiled gently, letting them completely drown in their absolute delusion, fully aware that the heavy, suffocating net was already pulled tight around them. They simply had not realized they were entirely trapped yet. The following week was entirely dedicated to the final, highly covert financial operations. While Helen spent her mornings at her expensive tennis clinics and her long afternoons shopping at the high-end outdoor mall, completely secure in her false reality, I locked myself inside my quiet study and meticulously executed a totally silent, flawlessly legal financial divorce. I started with our massive joint savings account. I did not close it, as a sudden closure would immediately trigger an automatic alert to Helen's mobile phone. Instead, I systematically, methodically drained it over the course of 4 quiet days. I transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars in highly liquid assets directly into a brand new, intensely secured account I had quietly opened at a completely different, highly exclusive banking institution on the opposite side of the city. This new account was solely in my name, fiercely protected by complex biometric security requirements and entirely invisible to anyone but me and my estate attorney. Next, I tackled the primary joint checking account, the deep, endless well Helen had used to aggressively subsidize her son's failures for the last 3 years. I carefully calculated the exact amount required to cover the upcoming utility bills, the heavy property taxes, and perhaps 2 weeks of her lavish, organic groceries. I left exactly that specific, highly calculated dollar amount in the account. Every single penny above that strict operational baseline was immediately swept away into my private digital vault. I watched the final digital confirmation screen slowly load on my computer monitor, the bright green letters definitively confirming the massive transfer of funds. I was perfectly sealing away the vast wealth she felt so fiercely and permanently entitled to, entirely unaware that a massive, life-altering financial hurricane was already forming just a few miles off her comfortable, sun-drenched coast. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my heavy leather chair, and simply looked at the digital calendar glowing quietly on my desk. It was the 28th day of the month. In exactly 3 short days, the absolute first of the month would arrive. It was the exact day Marcus religiously expected his $5,000 trust stipend to magically appear in his checking account, the very money he had arrogantly promised the luxury car dealership just days prior. It was also the exact week my attorney, Arthur, was scheduled to finally unleash the devastating, highly aggressive bank fraud report regarding the stolen $45,000 credit card charge. The heavy, complicated pieces were all perfectly arranged on the board. My assets were completely secured, the legal traps were fully primed, and my deeply entitled, entirely delusional enemies were blindly marching forward, directly into a massive, unavoidable slaughter. The first day of the new month used to be a completely unremarkable square on my calendar. But today, it was the perfectly timed release of a deeply devastating trap. I sat completely still in my darkened study long before the sun came up, simply listening to the absolute silence of the house and waiting for the inevitable panic to finally shatter it. Usually, on the first of the month, exactly at midnight, an automated digital system deep within my bank's heavily guarded mainframe seamlessly transferred $5,000 of my hard-earned wealth directly into Marcus's entirely undeserving checking account. For 10 long years, he had woken up on this specific day significantly richer without lifting a single finger, completely sheltered from the brutal, unforgiving reality of the actual working world. Today, however, that generous automated system had been permanently ripped out by its digital roots by my estate attorney. Marcus was waking up to an absolute zero balance, completely exposed to the harsh financial elements he had spent his entire adult life violently avoiding. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee at 6 o'clock in the morning, taking immense pleasure in the simple, methodical routine. While I waited for the telephone to inevitably ring, I quietly wondered how quickly the aggressively friendly salesman at the imported luxury car dealership would retract their fawning attention once his massive financing application inevitably imploded in his arrogant face. I also knew my attorney, Arthur, was executing the second, significantly heavier phase of our legal strike the very second the downtown financial institutions opened their heavy glass doors, meaning the pressure was about to exponentially multiply from a completely different direction. The telephone sitting on my heavy mahogany desk finally buzzed with an aggressive, highly agitated rhythm at exactly 8 o'clock. I let it ring 4 distinct times, slowly finishing my sip of warm coffee, before calmly picking up the heavy black receiver. Marcus did not even bother to say good morning. His voice was incredibly tight, practically vibrating with a frantic, entirely unearned indignation. He aggressively demanded to know if there was a massive, system-wide glitch in the family trust management portal. He stated in a tone dripping with furious entitlement that his automatic monthly transfer had completely failed to clear. Even worse, he angrily complained that his digital debit card had just been humiliatingly declined at a premium downtown coffee shop while he was trying to buy his morning espresso. He actually had the audacity to sound deeply offended, entirely acting as if I had personally and unprofessionally failed in my administrative duties as his personal, unpaid bank teller. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and let the silence hang heavily on the line for several long seconds, deliberately allowing his frantic anxiety to fully saturate the quiet space between us. I told him there was absolutely no digital glitch. I kept my voice incredibly soft, permanently stripping away any lingering trace of the angry, defeated old man he sincerely thought he had completely manipulated just days prior at our Sunday family dinner. I clearly and plainly stated that his financial umbilical cord had been permanently, legally severed. He actually laughed out loud. It was a sharp, barking sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He told me to stop making stupid, deeply unfunny jokes because he had a very important, high-stakes meeting with the luxury automobile dealership at exactly noon to finalize the heavy financial paperwork on his new German sports car. He aggressively reminded me of my supposedly supportive words at the dining room table, entirely believing my fake temporary capitulation was a permanent, unconditional surrender to his absolute brilliance. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply told him he was no longer a protected beneficiary of the family trust. I explained, utilizing the incredibly precise legal terminology Arthur and I had finalized, that my attorney had officially dissolved his entire protected status and permanently terminated the monthly living stipend. I told him the $5,000 a month was completely gone forever, and the massive, life-changing inheritance he was blindly banking on for his comfortable future had been entirely redirected to a heavily audited charitable foundation for disabled military veterans. The line went completely, absolutely dead silent. The utter terrifying reality of his newfound poverty was finally struggling to penetrate his thick, heavily reinforced wall of absolute arrogance. I could practically hear the rusty gears in his head frantically grinding, trying to mathematically calculate how a man with zero actual income pays rent on a luxury downtown apartment. When he finally spoke again, his voice had completely dropped an entire octave, shifting entirely from entitled annoyance to genuine creeping terror. He stammered, asking me what in the world I was talking about, aggressively demanding I fix the massive error immediately before he called his mother to tell her I was having some sort of severe, undiagnosed mental breakdown. That was the exact moment I drove the final, crushing steel nail directly into the coffin of his entirely fabricated life. I told him he could certainly call his mother if he wanted to, but she was entirely powerless to stop the devastating financial avalanche that was already roaring down the mountain toward him. I casually mentioned the heavy platinum dive watch securely fastened to his left wrist. I asked him if he honestly, truly believed I had not immediately noticed my black premium credit card missing from my private leather wallet the very morning he boldly stole it. I could hear his breathing become rapid and incredibly shallow through the telephone receiver, completely unaware that his beloved mother was about to face a very similar, equally devastating financial reckoning of her very own in just a few short hours. I informed him that the exact charge of $45,000 had been formally and legally reported as a massive, deliberate act of absolute fraud. I told him Arthur had officially filed the heavy, sworn legal affidavits with the primary banking institution and the local authorities exactly 1 hour ago. I explained, with brutal, uncompromising clarity, that the highly aggressive fraud department was going to instantly reverse the massive charge. This meant the deeply connected, highly exclusive boutique jeweler was going to be coming directly after him by the end of the business day. They would demand either the physical return of the completely unworn, pristine merchandise, or the immediate, absolute payment of $45,000 in cold, hard cash. I thoroughly enjoyed pointing out the beautiful, absolute irony of his current situation. I noted that just yesterday. He could have easily used his generous, completely unearned trust stipend to secure a high-interest personal loan to desperately cover the massive theft and save his own skin. But today, because I had meticulously coordinated the complete destruction of his steady income with the aggressive reporting of his brazen crime, he was an entirely broke, heavily indebted man facing a highly probable grand larceny charge. He had absolutely zero verified income, an entirely destroyed credit score, and absolutely no feasible way to appease the furious, highly litigious jewelers he had essentially defrauded in broad daylight. He began to physically panic, his arrogant, carefully constructed corporate vocabulary completely disintegrating into terrified, broken half-sentences. He frantically tried to backpedal, desperately claiming it was all a massive, hilarious misunderstanding. He begged me to just hold the fraud report, pleading for a chance to drive over and personally explain the profound, unavoidable business necessity of the incredibly expensive timepiece. He promised he was going to pay me back with the massive profits from his upcoming international merger. I told him he could freely explain his brilliant, highly complex international business strategies to the aggressive corporate debt collectors and the local police detectives when they inevitably arrived at his door. I gently placed the heavy black receiver back onto the cradle, completely and permanently cutting off his desperate, pathetic pleading. I sat back in my quiet, sunlit study, entirely surrounded by the absolute, unbroken peace I had meticulously fought for, watching the very first massive domino officially crash to the floor. There is a terrifying, breathtaking speed at which a fabricated life completely disintegrates the moment the stolen money finally stops flowing. For my deeply entitled stepson and my incredibly deceitful wife, that disintegration happened before the sun even reached its peak. Following my brief, devastating phone call, the heavy silence in my study was quickly replaced by a relentless, frantic barrage of digital notifications. I placed my smartphone on the center of my desk and simply watched the screen light up with incoming calls, completely refusing to answer a single one. Marcus left 7 distinct, heavily panicked voicemails over the course of 2 hours. I listened to them in chronological order, taking immense, quiet satisfaction in the rapid, absolute destruction of his arrogant corporate persona. In the first message, his voice was still laced with a thin, desperate layer of anger. He loudly demanded I call the bank back and cancel the fraud report, completely acting as if my legal retaliation was merely a temporary, highly inconvenient administrative error. By the third voicemail, the anger had entirely evaporated, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He frantically explained that the aggressive fraud department at my premium banking institution had successfully reversed the $45,000 charge. The highly exclusive boutique jeweler had immediately called his mobile phone, their tone absolutely devoid of the fawning customer service he had experienced just days prior. The store manager had plainly informed him that if the pristine, unworn watch or a certified cashier's check for the full $45,000 was not delivered to their showroom by 5 o'clock that evening. They would instantly dispatch the local police detectives to his luxury apartment to arrest him for grand larceny. By the seventh and final voicemail, Marcus was practically sobbing into the receiver. He confessed that he had desperately run to a high-interest predatory lending office downtown, frantically trying to secure a massive emergency loan to cover the jeweler's strict ultimatum. The loan officers had taken one single look at his completely barren credit history, his absolute lack of verifiable income, and the suddenly dissolved family trust, and they had practically laughed him out of their lobby. He was entirely trapped in a financial corner of his own meticulous making. He was frantically trying to figure out how to physically return the merchandise to avoid a prison cell, completely unaware that his reckless, drunken bragging over the weekend had already sealed a deeply expensive fate he could not possibly escape. Exactly 10 minutes after the final, pathetic voicemail ended, the heavy front door of my house flew violently open, slamming aggressively against the interior wall. Helen stormed into the foyer, her face flushed a deep, furious crimson, her expensive designer handbag slipping carelessly off her shoulder. She had clearly received a completely hysterical, terrified phone call from her beloved son, and she was arriving with the absolute, unshakable certainty that she could simply scream and manipulate me into fixing his massive, catastrophic mistakes. She marched directly down the hallway and burst into my private study without knocking, bringing a sudden, chaotic storm of manufactured outrage into my perfectly quiet sanctuary. She slammed her hands flat onto my mahogany desk, leaning heavily over the wood, and began to viciously demand answers. She loudly accused me of completely losing my mind, shrieking that my cruel, vindictive actions were going to send her innocent, brilliant boy to a cold prison cell. She demanded, utilizing the exact same highly condescending tone she had used in the kitchen days earlier, that I pick up the telephone, call my estate attorney, and immediately restore the monthly $5,000 trust stipend. She completely ignored the massive, undeniable fact that her son had brazenly stolen my private property. In her deeply warped, endlessly entitled mind, I was the malicious villain for simply refusing to willingly finance his criminal behavior. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up from my heavy leather chair. I simply looked at her, entirely stripping away 15 years of warm, accommodating affection, and let her view the absolute, cold reality of the man she had been actively robbing. I slowly opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it deliberately onto the smooth wood and slid it smoothly across the desk until it rested directly beneath her trembling hands. I firmly instructed her to open the folder and read the top page before she dared to scream another word at me. Helen snatched the folder with a deeply dramatic, exasperated sigh, fully expecting to find meaningless legal jargon or a petty accounting of Marcus's minor debts. She flipped the heavy cover open. Resting right on top was the highly detailed, meticulously highlighted financial audit I had compiled over the weekend. It was a complete, undeniable map of her endless deception. The very first highlighted line was the $2,500 phantom plumbing invoice. Right beneath it was the $4,000 fake veterinary surgery bill. The spreadsheet went on for 3 solid pages, documenting every single fraudulent transfer, every manipulated grocery receipt, and every stolen dollar she had quietly funneled directly into her son's ravenous pockets over the last 3 years. The final, massive total of $85,000 was printed in bold, undeniable black ink at the very bottom. I watched the aggressive, fiery red color completely and instantly drain from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, terrifying shade of pale white. Her mouth fell slightly open, and her eyes darted frantically back and forth across the undeniable evidence of her massive betrayal. The absolute, unshakable power dynamic in the room fundamentally violently shifted in a single second. The screaming entirely stopped. The deeply manufactured outrage instantly evaporated. She was completely exposed, caught entirely red-handed in a massive, undeniable lie she could never possibly explain away. She stared at the thick stack of printed evidence, slowly comprehending that the massive, luxurious house she felt so permanently entitled to was quickly becoming a heavily guarded fortress she would never be allowed to sleep in again. She weakly attempted to formulate a desperate excuse, her voice instantly dropping to a pathetic, shaking whisper. She stammered that I simply did not understand the heavy pressure she was under, that Marcus had been in desperate trouble, and that she was only trying to protect her family without bothering me with the stressful details. I cut her off with a single, sharp raise of my hand. I told her the only family she had ever actively protected was the parasite currently sobbing in his luxury apartment, waiting for the police to arrive. I explicitly stated that my hard-earned wealth was not an endless, unguarded buffet for her to secretly raid whenever her adult son demanded a new toy. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, and delivered the final, crushing blow. I informed her that the primary joint checking account and the massive shared savings account had been entirely drained and securely moved to a private institution she could never access. I told her the highly lucrative commercial real estate portfolio she had always assumed would fund her lavish retirement had been permanently legally locked away. Then, I reached back into the open drawer and pulled out a second, significantly thinner document heavily stamped with my attorney's official seal. I slid the formal separation agreement across the desk, placing it directly over her fraudulent accounting spreadsheet. I calmly told her that Arthur was actively drafting the final, unappealable divorce papers based on severe financial infidelity, massive coordinated fraud, and a complete fundamental breach of marital trust. I told her she had exactly 2 hours to pack a single suitcase with her personal clothing and violently vacate my property before I officially called the local authorities to have her formally removed for trespassing. She physically collapsed into the heavy guest chair opposite my desk, her expensive handbag tumbling to the floor. The sheer, terrifying reality of her newfound poverty was crashing over her in massive, suffocating waves. For 15 years, she had lived a life of absolute luxury, entirely funded by a man she secretly viewed as a gullible, endlessly generous fool. Now, she was staring down the barrel of her twilight years with absolutely zero access to my vast wealth, entirely tied to an adult son who was currently drowning in massive, unpayable debt and facing serious felony charges. She had sacrificed her own incredibly comfortable, deeply secure retirement for a thief who could not even afford to buy his own morning coffee. I stood up from my desk, walked smoothly past her completely shattered, sobbing form, and opened the heavy study door. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. I felt entirely, wonderfully clean. The massive, deeply infected wound that had been silently poisoning my life for over a decade had finally been violently lanced, and the absolute healing process was officially underway. The absolute final collapse of a deeply entitled life does not happen with a dignified, explosive confrontation. It happens with a slow, agonizing whimper of unpaid bills, locked doors, and severely broken pride. When you intentionally and legally sever the financial lifeline of a comfortable parasite, the resulting panic is incredibly fast and utterly devastating. Marcus managed to physically avoid a terrifying grand larceny arrest by frantically driving back to the downtown boutique jeweler a mere 15 minutes before their heavy glass doors securely locked for the evening. He burst into the quiet, heavily air-conditioned showroom practically hyperventilating, entirely stripped of the arrogant, high-level corporate persona he had obnoxiously paraded around the day before. He threw the $45,000 platinum dive watch onto the polished glass counter, aggressively demanding they cancel the massive, fraudulent charge and wipe his slate completely clean. However, a luxury jeweler catering to the ultra-wealthy does not operate like a common, forgiving department store. The heavily armed private security guard stood closely behind his shoulder while the stern store manager carefully inspected the returned merchandise under a bright, high-powered jeweler's loupe. The arrogant, drunken arm-waving Marcus had proudly done at our Sunday family dinner carried a devastating, permanent consequence. He had deeply scratched the polished platinum band against the sharp edge of our heavy oak dining table. The store manager flatly refused to accept the damaged piece as a clean, complete return. He coldly informed my highly panicked stepson that he was instantly legally liable for a $10,000 depreciation and administrative restocking fee, due immediately in certified funds. When Marcus frantically tried to swipe his newly issued, heavily restricted digital debit card, it was immediately and humiliatingly declined right in front of the other wealthy patrons. The jeweler did not offer a generous payment plan or a single ounce of sympathy. They formally filed a massive civil lawsuit against him the very next morning, adding heavy corporate legal fees to his already insurmountable, crushing debt. That $10,000 legal judgment was merely the very first heavy drop in a massive, terrifying financial monsoon. Without the steady, guaranteed flow of the $5,000 monthly trust stipend silently backing his lavish lifestyle, the heavy walls of his entirely fake entrepreneurial empire instantly caved in on top of him. The luxury downtown apartment building where he lived strictly required proof of a massive, consistent income to maintain a high-end lease. When his scheduled first-of-the-month rent payment bounced entirely, the aggressive corporate property management company began formal legal eviction proceedings within exactly 72 hours. The high-end, exclusive networking clubs he had proudly bragged about revoked his expensive memberships for absolute non-payment. His supposed international business investors took one single look at his completely ruined credit score, his pending civil lawsuits, and his sudden, absolute lack of liquid capital, and they completely vanished like thin smoke in a heavy wind. He was entirely exposed as a total, complete fraud, brutally stripped of the unearned wealth that had artificially inflated his fragile ego for his entire adult life. Helen's brutal, unavoidable reality was equally devastating. Exactly 2 hours after I slid the formal separation agreement across my mahogany desk, she slowly dragged 2 heavy designer suitcases through my massive front door, violently sobbing into a linen handkerchief. She was entirely unable to manipulate, cry, or negotiate her way out of the ironclad consequences of her massive, multi-year theft. She had absolutely nowhere else to go but to her son's rapidly crumbling, deeply stressful reality. She moved directly into Marcus's apartment right as the heavy, brightly colored legal eviction notices were being aggressively taped to his thick wooden door. The woman who had comfortably spent 15 solid years seamlessly swiping my premium credit cards for organic groceries, imported wines, and spontaneous, highly expensive spa weekends was suddenly forced to desperately budget for generic instant coffee and cheap canned soup. She was entirely trapped in a tiny, suffocating living space with the very son she had blindly, foolishly ruined her own incredibly comfortable future to protect. I sincerely doubt either of them will ever possess the fundamental, necessary self-awareness to admit their own catastrophic greed. I highly suspect they will spend the rest of their miserable, heavily indebted days fiercely blaming me for their absolute, undeniable downfall. I often wonder how long it will realistically take before the crushing, suffocating weight of their massive, collective poverty turns them violently against one another in that tiny, cramped apartment. Fortunately, their bitter, completely powerless anger is no longer my financial or emotional burden to bear. I spent my Friday evening exactly the way a man who has successfully defended his entire life's work absolutely should. I walked out onto my expansive, perfectly quiet back porch, a deeply peaceful space I paid for with 40 years of grueling, honest, and completely undeniable labor. I poured myself a heavy, generous measure of a 20-year-old, deeply complex reserve bourbon, the exact same incredibly expensive bottle Marcus had brazenly drank from the night he confidently stole my credit card. The massive suburban house behind me was entirely, beautifully silent. There was absolutely no manufactured domestic drama, no endless exhausting demands for unearned capital, and absolutely no parasites masquerading as a loving, supportive family. The massive commercial real estate empire I had spent decades carefully building was completely, legally secure. It was fully, legally bound to eventually house disabled military veterans who actually understand the profound, heavy weight of true sacrifice and personal responsibility. I took a slow, deep sip of the warm, amber liquid, feeling the sharp, beautiful burn slide down my throat. I watched the golden sun slowly set over the manicured tree line, feeling the absolute, unshakable control over my entire legacy finally settling deeply into my aging bones. The agonizing war was completely over. The relentless, greedy enemies were entirely vanquished by their own arrogant hands, and I was finally, completely free. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the very end. If you sincerely enjoyed watching a heavily entitled thief and a deeply deceitful, manipulative partner get exactly what they absolutely deserved, please take a quick second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who truly appreciates a highly satisfying, completely legal retaliation. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on how this played out, so please leave a comment down below with the single word karma, so I know you made it to the absolute finish line. Finally, please do not forget to hit the hype button so this video can reach more mature viewers exactly like you, who deeply love a perfectly executed plan.